Hi, I'm Janine Booth and welcome to my presentation on Marxism and Autism, subtitled There is a Spectrum Haunting Europe. That's my favourite joke. For those not in the know, autism is a spectrum condition, meaning it affects different people in different ways, and the first line of Marx and Engels' 1848 Communist Manifesto was, "There is a spectre haunting Europe." There are different approaches to understanding autism within our society. Perhaps the predominant one is a medical approach. It sees autism as a disease or a tragedy, and autistic people as being broken and needing fixing. But there is a more progressive approach that's been developing over a number of years. That more progressive approach recognises neurological diversity, i.e. that the human species is neurologically diverse. Different people have different brain wiring. But that more progressive approach, while welcome, doesn't necessarily locate autism and neurodiversity within the social structures of society. But it's important to do so. Firstly, because all disability exists in a social context, but secondly, particularly with autism, autism is an issue that relates to the way that people interact socially, so we have to consider it in a social context. We're all expected to follow social rules. But who makes those social rules? So what I want to do here is to explore whether Marxism can help us understand autism and the autistic experience in our current society. So first of all, let's look at our definitions of our two themes. Autism. Autism is an atypical neurology, a different brain wiring. Perhaps if the majority of the population is Windows, autistic people are Apple Mac. This atypical neurology leads to an atypical processing, different cognitive function, atypical communication, differences in social interaction, and in sensitivity to various sensory inputs such as noise or light. Marxism is a strand of socialism which is scientific socialism. It studies socialism rather than simply wishing for it, providing a critique of capitalism and seeing the way forward as the self-emancipation of the working class, the basic exploited class under capitalism, a class which Marx described as having radical change, i.e. the potential and the power to liberate not just itself, but other oppressed people too. Marxism sees change, social liberation, as coming through class struggle, with the ultimate aim of abolishing the division of society into classes. So let's look at the impact of capitalism on autistic lives. Capitalism brought development, it brought knowledge, understanding, scientific inquiry, the potential of providing more support for people. It accelerated production. It was a big improvement on what came before it. However, it also increases social pressure. It brings people together in a much more intense way, and it increases light, sound, other sensory stimulation. So for autistic people, modern capitalism is both developed and distressing. It brings huge advantages and huge potential, but it can also bring great distress. And a key way in which it does this is that capitalism puts a premium on how good you are socially. For instance, whether you get a job or not can depend as much on how your potential employer thinks you'll fit in as on how good you are at the job. So when we talk about autistic people being disabled, we mean that capitalism disables autistic people. Over the last few years, there's been a significant increase in autism diagnosis, and it's interesting to look at the different ways in which this has been explained. The medical model explains it as an epidemic. There's this huge increase. There must be an epidemic of autism. Look at this graphic here, this badge. Scared yet, it says. Well, actually, I'm more scared of the people who produced that badge and the thinking behind it than I am of the fact that there's an increased recognition of the prevalence of autism. The more progressive or accurate explanation is that society has an increased awareness of autism, an increased availability of diagnosis, including things like online diagnostic tools, and that the criteria for diagnosing autism in an individual have been steadily widened down the years. However, I think we can, and it's important to, go further than that. The increasing social pressure that capitalism places on people, the increasing sensory overload that is thrown at us, causes such distress that more and more autistic people seek diagnosis in order to access help. So society and its autistic members have coming into conflict with each other more and more. An awful lot of autistic people get their autism diagnosis having initially sought help, for example, with a mental health problem with anxiety or depression. We also need to look at austerity and class differences in autistic experiences. Now, since the economic crisis that started in 2008, governments have pursued austerity policies, making working class people pay for a crisis that we didn't create. Those austerity policies have deepened poverty, taken away access to support, etc. And in that situation, and in class difference in general, autistic people from wealthier families can often cope better. Not saying that life is easy if you're from a wealthier family, but at least there's more access to resource and care. The cuts in services that have been made are affecting autistic people. We've seen all sorts of services have their funding cut or closed down altogether, whether that's family support services or employment support services or day centres or other services. But austerity also causes social distress and insecurity. So for the people who are having their services taken away or who fear having their services taken away, social pressure intensifies. Often you're expected to turn to charities when there isn't public support available. But it's worth looking at, and maybe a subject for a more in-depth discussion elsewhere, the role of charities, because although charities do provide useful services, and some people rely on those, and they definitely provide good value to some people's lives, they also have a quite contradictory role and don't always stand on the same side of those of us fighting for liberation. So in this photograph here, you can see teachers at Sybil Elgar School, which is a National Autistic Society school, who were forced to go on strike a couple of years ago because the NAS refused to give them a decent pay rise and expected them to work for lower pay than nationally negotiated rates for teachers. Autism, neurodiversity and production. In any Marxist analysis, it's important to look at the exploitation of labour. That's central to a Marxist analysis. Autistic people are disadvantaged in employment. Here are just 3 statistics, all from the UK. The situation is similar in other countries. 43% of autistic adults have left or lost a job because of their condition. 41% of autistic adults over 55 have spent over 10 years without a paid job. And 37% of autistic adults have never been in paid employment after the age of 16. And in recent years, particularly since the economic crisis, we've seen an employer's offensive which has brought in new management techniques and insecure employment, which can have an even greater effect on autistic people. So, for example, short-term contracts, short working hours, unpredictable working hours, 0 hours contracts, they can have a detrimental effect on everyone. But if you have an autistic mindset and therefore rely a great deal on predictability and on routine, that can be even more intolerable. We've also seen a shift towards customer services, but towards soft or social skills being valued above technical skills, even in quite technical industries such as public transport. And we've seen public services commodified, with service users no longer seen as service users but seen as customers. Again, this can create problems for people who don't whose focus is their technical ability at a job rather than on socially defined social skills. But alongside that, we have seen employers, and no doubt it's welcome, making more effort to recruit and accommodate autistic workers, but sometimes they'll let it slip that one of the reasons they're doing that is they see the potential to exploit autistic people's special talents. They talk about how much more productive certain autistic people can be and how less likely we are to be distracted by social gossip, etc. This, to me, represents the exploitation and the commodification of autistic people's special talents rather than their valuing. Work under capitalism is very regimented, whether that is the physical environment of work, or the pace at which work's done, or the way in which work's expected to be done, or the targets that you're expected to reach, etc. And it provides very little or no scope or flexibility for people who think differently and want to do it in a different way. So crucial to winning a better future for autistic people, particularly at work, is to change work, not workers. There's plenty of advice available for autistic people on how to get a job and keep a job. Most of it, valuable though it may be, is focused on changing yourself so you'll impress the employer more, so you'll fit in better. Basically, how to act neurotypical. But far better than that would be if work had to change, so the physical work environment, the way in which work is organised, etc., is more accessible and comfortable for people, whatever their brain wiring. Central to that is the idea of workers' control, whether as individuals or collectively, workers having control over the environment in which we work, whether that's the sensory environment or other aspects of the environment, and having control over how the job is done. Another thing that's happened over the last few decades, in fact in the shadow of labour movement defeats, has been a shift in the political discourse from collective to the individual. So people being berated over their lifestyle choices rather than challenging capital and its social problems. So you'll, for instance, hear a lot more about people's eating habits than about the habits of food retailers in marketing unhealthy food, for instance. We also have an emphasis on success, which sets people up to fail, because if society sets standards of success which you don't meet, the implication then is that you have fallen short, that that's somehow your fault. One example of the problems created by this shift from collective to individual is the legal notion of reasonable adjustments or reasonable accommodations, which is changes that can be made, for example at work, to enable an autistic or otherwise disabled person to do their job. Now, it was a step forward that this has been incorporated into the law of lots of countries, and you now have the right to, you know, get changes made to your work. But those changes are only for the individual. They're only when the individual identifies themselves and identifies their disability, and you have to prove that there's something wrong with you, that you have some kind of shortfall in your functioning to get that change, and then the change is then only for you. It would be far better for workplaces to change generally, to become more accessible, to become more autism friendly, to address it in a collective rather than individual way. So let's look at the political economy of autism, or of the neurodiverse working class. Marx talked about the idea of the political economy of the working class, meaning the working class being able to force on capitalism changes to its policies that will benefit working class people, even if that's costly to capitalism. And if we wrote a list of all the changes we'd want to achieve more equality and rights for autistic people, the bill might be quite hefty for capitalism. But we want these demands for political and economic change. We want to alleviate discrimination, exclusion and distress, and we want to advance equality regardless of what its cost is to the existing capitalist system. And talking of lists of demands for political and economic change, a group of activists are currently working with John McDonnell MP to develop an Autism and Neurodiversity manifesto for the Labour Party, a list of policies for Labour to take into the 2020 general election that will deliver big advances in equality and challenge discrimination. We need the workers' movement's demands to reflect the neurological diversity of the working class. So not just specific demands for autistic people, but to ensure that all its policies don't assume just the typical method of thinking, but recognise that just as the working class is ethnically diverse, gender diverse, sexually diverse, etc., it is also neurologically diverse. And this brings us to the discussion that we all need to be having, which is what sort of society are we fighting for? What will socialism look like, and how will it acknowledge and accept neurological diversity in a way that capitalism doesn't? There are some more useful theoretical approaches, which I'm just going to name check here rather than look into in depth. They're subjects for a future discussion. Some from Marx, some from other thinkers. Marx, historical materialism, the idea that you understand society by studying it and how we got to where we are now, and definite social structures rather than taking a simple snapshot of where we are now. That's essential in a study of this issue. Commodity fetishism. Marx wrote about the way that under capitalism everything is dealt with as though it is a marketable commodity, even human issues, and I think we can see that relevance to that in issues like the marketing of autistic people's special talents. Marx wrote about alienation, the way in which the products of your labour are taken away from you and separated, and that production-based alienation, how that relates to social alienation. Moving on to other writers, that's Emil Durkheim there, and he wrote about a concept called anomie, which is about how society sets standards for people to achieve, but then doesn't resource everybody to achieve those standards. And it's in that shortfall that social distress can occur. This chap is Antonio Gramsci. He's an Italian Marxist. He wrote about cultural hegemony. Again, this could be relevant and interesting for us to explore more, because it's about the way that a society which is or has the potential to be culturally diverse actually just gets culturally dominated by the ruling class's ideas, to the exclusion of ideas and cultures which don't fit in with its norms. And this chap is Erving Goffman. He wrote about the idea of stigma as being socially discrediting. So he wrote about how minorities, racial minorities, religious minorities, sexual minorities, etc., because they're seen as deviant by society, society focuses entirely on your deviance rather than on your personality as a whole, creating consequent disadvantage for you. And finally, the social model of disability. For hundreds of years, disability was seen simply as a medical problem. There's something wrong with you that needs fixing, or you're a burden to society. In the 1970s, the radical self-organised disabled people's movement insisted that we look at disability differently from that. And that became known as the social model of disability. And what that says is we may have impairments, but our disabilities are the barriers that society places in our way to stop us accessing equal participation. And therefore what the fight for liberation involves is identifying those barriers and fighting to remove them. We also need to think about, if we're talking about socialism, Marxism and autism, we need to talk about autistic people's participation in the Labour movement and on the left. We need to audit the failures of the left and of the Labour Party. And we need to recognise our agency for change, our historical consciousness. So we're not just about studying the past, studying the present and polishing up our crystal balls to look into the future. We're about studying the past and the present in order to change the future, to create a better world for everybody. We need our movements to be accessible, to be habitable for autistic people. Trade unions, Labour Party, socialist groups need to be thinking about your events, your activities. Would an autistic person find those welcoming, or would they find them distressing? What changes can you make to make what we're doing more accessible? One good development over recent years that I've been played a big part in, I think, is that trade unions are providing more training for their activists about autism and about representing and involving autistic workers. Hopefully that will have a good impact. So I'm going to leave it there. This is the start of a debate, of a conversation. It's by no means a definitive word on autism and Marxism. It doesn't want to be or pretend to be. I hope, though, it will get people talking. Here's the address for a section on my personal website about it. Please visit, please comment. You can contact me via that as well. We can get together and have a discussion in whatever format suits you. Thank you very much for sitting through all of this, I hope you find it useful, and I hope we will engage with each other in the future. Thank you very much.